What starts as just another open and shut case in a small-town courtroom turns into something no one could have seen coming. When a teenage boy steps up to defend himself against a powerful system built to crush people like him, the judge, the prosecutor, and the entire town think it'll be over in minutes. But they have no idea who they're dealing with. Because this isn't just another kid from the neighborhood, this is the son of a legacy, the voice of a generation, and the one person brave enough to tear their case apart piece by piece. What happens next? It's a battle of truth bias, and the fight to be heard in a world that never expected him to win. And trust me, you're not gonna believe how it ends. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let us know in the comments what time are you listening and where are you tuning in from. We'd love to hear your story too. Let's get into it. The wooden benches creaked softly as the townsfolk began to settle in their conversations, nothing more than a low hum beneath the steady ticking of the old brass clock hanging above the judge's bench. The morning sun slanted through the tall, arched windows of the Montgomery County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the floor, where flecks of dust danced in the light like tiny ghosts carrying whispered stories from years gone by. The air smelled faintly of aged wood floor polish, and something sharper, something heavier like the weight of judgment itself hanging in the air, pressing down on everyone who dared to breathe too deeply. Isaiah Walker, known to most folks around here simply as Zay, stood alone near the defendant's table, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. He wasn't in a suit like they show on television when they parade defendants out in front of the cameras. He wasn't in a prison jumpsuit either, though the deputies probably would have liked that. No, Zay wore what he always wore, a simple dark hoodie, the kind you throw on without thinking when the weather turns a little cooler than you expected. His chin was tilted ever so slightly upward, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in something quieter, something closer to survival. He glanced over his shoulder once, his dark brown eyes scanning the gallery. He knew most of the faces. Mr. Jenkins from the gas station. Mrs. Thompson, his old-school librarian. Even Deacon Earl, who used to pat him on the head after Sunday service when Zay was no taller than the church pews. But their faces weren't warm today. They weren't smiling. Most of them carried the same tight-drawn expression, half curiosity, half disappointment, as if they'd already decided the outcome before the first word had even been spoken. Across the room, Judge Randall Whitaker leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, the same chair he'd sat in for more than 30 years. His thinning white hair framed a face that had long since grown weary of pretending to care. The heavy gold ring on his finger clicked softly against the armrest as he drummed his fingers slow and steady, like a man waiting for the waitress to bring his coffee, not the man holding someone's future in his hands. He adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose, peering down over the rims with the kind of look that stripped a man of his dignity without needing to say a single word. "Let's see what we've got here," the judge muttered under his breath, flipping open the case file with all the enthusiasm of a man skimming through junk mail. The prosecutor, Karen Steele, stood tall beside her table, her mouth curled into a faint, practiced smirk. She didn't need to look at the file. She didn't need to check her notes. This was a slam dunk as far as she was concerned. Another arrest, another conviction, another notch on the belt of a career built on making examples out of young men like Zay. The charges read like the beginning of a tragedy: assaulting a police officer, destruction of public property, inciting a riot. It didn't matter that the so-called riot had started as a peaceful candlelight vigil. It didn't matter that the surveillance footage had somehow gone missing. What mattered now was that Zay stood alone, accused and presumed guilty by nearly everyone in that room. He could feel it in the way they looked at him, as if the cuffs were already locked around his wrists, as if the next sound he'd hear would be the heavy slam of the judge's gavel sealing his fate. And yet Zay didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't fidget like most kids his age would when the weight of the law pressed down on them. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed not on the judge, not on the prosecutor, but on the empty space just beyond them, as if he were staring through them, past them, toward something only he could see. He felt the sweat gathering at the back of his neck, but he didn't reach up to wipe it away. He felt the thump of his heartbeat, not in his chest but deep in his throat, as if every breath carried the risk of falling apart. And still he stood his ground, holding on to the only thing he had left: his silence. Outside, the sirens wailed softly in the distance, a reminder that life on the other side of those courthouse walls kept moving indifferent to the lives being ground to dust inside. Zay knew that sound well. He'd grown up hearing it echo through the streets at night, learned early on that in this town justice didn't sound like freedom, it sounded like handcuffs snapping shut under the yellow glare of a street lamp. He stole one last glance toward the gallery, toward the front row where his grandmother, Clara Walker, sat with her back, impossibly straight, her hands folded tight in her lap. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, Lord, her eyes were alive with something fierce, something burning quietly like a coal that had never gone out. She didn't nod, she didn't smile. She just watched him, holding her breath like the rest of them, waiting to see if the boy she'd raised had any fight left in him. And as the judge leaned forward, clearing his throat with that same tired condescension he'd used on 100 young black men before, Zay let his lips part just slightly, drawing in one slow, steady breath. Not to plead, not to beg, but to choose. And in that moment, standing alone in a room that had already decided his story was over, Zay Walker knew exactly where his story was about to begin. Judge Whitaker leaned forward on his elbows, his heavy frame settling against the leather as if gravity had won another round. His fingers curled lazily around the edges of the case file, while his lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the kind of grin a man wears when he already knows the ending, and he's just humoring the performance. He glanced toward the court clerk, then at the gallery, as if searching for someone who might share the joke he hadn't spoken yet before finally resting his gaze squarely on Zay. Well, the judge said, his voice slow and dry, dragging out the syllable like he was chewing on it. What do we have here? Another Montgomery protester thinking he's above the law. The gallery let out a ripple of soft chuckles, not loud enough to disturb the proceedings, but just sharp enough to slice through the air and reach Zay's ears. Even the bailiff, standing stiff by the wall, let a corner of his mouth twitch in silent agreement, as if they all knew this script by heart. The sound wasn't violent, it wasn't hateful, but it carried something worse: dismissal. The kind of sound that says you were already counted out long before you ever stepped through the door. Zay didn't move. He didn't so much as blink. His breathing stayed, even though every instinct in him begged to clench his fists or shift his weight just to feel something solid under his skin. He had spent years watching this very courtroom from the back rows as a boy, listening to his grandmother whisper under her breath about justice and the ones who stood in the way of it. And now, standing in the center of it all, he felt every eye in the room peeling back layers of who they thought he was: just a kid from the East Side, just another headline waiting to happen. Whitaker leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest, like a man about to settle into his favorite chair for a Sunday ball game. He looked over the rim of his glasses, his voice oozing with something between boredom and sarcasm. "I don't imagine you've got much to say for yourself," he added, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Another soft wave of laughter rippled through the courtroom, smaller this time, but sharper, like tiny needles finding their mark. Zay let his jaw tighten for half a breath before loosening it again. The pressure behind his ribs began to build the way it always did when the walls felt like they were closing in. But this time he didn't push it down. He let it rise, let it settle in his throat like a slow, steady drumbeat. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of Karen Steele out of the corner of his eye. The prosecutor stood motionless, her arms crossed her weight, leaning casually to one side like a woman already standing on the victory platform. Her smirk never wavered, not even when the judge spoke again. "You've got a public defender sitting right there." Whitaker continued, gesturing half-heartedly toward the woman seated beside Zay, who had barely looked up since the hearing began. "Might be the only smart decision you make today, son." The word "son" hit harder than Zay expected. It wasn't affectionate. It wasn't fatherly. It was condescending, sharp enough to make his grandmother's fingers twitch in her lap. Zay felt it like a hook, digging into the softest part of him, but he didn't let it show. Not yet. Not until he was ready. With slow, deliberate movement, Zay slid his hands out of his pockets, letting his fingers rest on the edge of the table, curling lightly around the cool surface. He took in one long breath through his nose, then another before lifting his chin just enough to meet the judge's gaze directly for the first time. And then, with a voice steady enough to make the clerk stop typing mid-keystroke, Zay spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his words carrying clear across the silent courtroom, "I'd like permission to represent myself." The room didn't erupt the way movies make it seem. No one gasped or shouted. But something colder happened instead. The air itself seemed to thin out like someone had cracked open a window in the middle of winter. You could feel it. The collective tightening of shoulders, the exchanged glances, the eyebrows inching upward, as if to say, did he really just say that? Judge Whittaker's face broke, not with anger but with amusement so thick it almost sounded like pity. He leaned forward again, both elbows planted firmly on the desk, this time his voice dropping into something lower, something quieter, like a man savoring the last sip of a cheap drink. "You'll what?" he asked, dragging out the words like they tasted bitter on his tongue. Zay cleared his throat, once steadying his breath. "I'll be defending myself," he repeated louder this time, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Karen Steele let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that sounds like someone choking on their own arrogance. She shook her head, turning slightly toward the jury box, as if inviting them to join in on the joke, but no one spoke. Not even the bailiff moved. Whittaker sat back, crossing his arms again, squinting down at Zay like he was peering at a puzzle missing too many pieces. "Son, this isn't a game," he warned, though there was no real warning in his voice. "You're facing real charges, real consequences." Zay swallowed hard, pressing his palms flat against the table, now the surface trembling ever so slightly beneath his fingers. He didn't look toward his grandmother. He didn't look toward the gallery. He kept his eyes locked on the man who already believed he had nothing left to lose. "I understand that, Sir." Zay replied each word, slow, measured, and razor-sharp, "but I know exactly what I'm doing." And just like that, the low hum of the courtroom seemed to fade into nothing, as if the walls themselves had leaned in closer to listen. Zay straightened his back, letting his hands fall calmly to his sides once more, as if to show he had nothing to hide. The judge leaned back again, his expression unreadable now, the smirk slowly dissolving into something harder to place. For the first time since the hearing began, the laughter stopped completely, and in the heavy silence that followed, the weight of Zay's choice settled over the room like a thick, unspoken truth no one could ignore. For a moment, nothing happened. No one moved. No one breathed. It felt like the whole courthouse had been frozen in place, like time itself had paused just long enough to let that one impossible sentence settle into the floorboards. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair creaked softly, the sound sharp against the silence, like the snap of a twig in the middle of a dark, empty forest. Judge Whittaker narrowed his eyes slightly, leaning back in his chair once again, though this time there was no trace of amusement left on his face. It wasn't anger either, not yet. It was something closer to disbelief, the kind of look a man gives when the ground shifts beneath him, but he refuses to admit he felt it. Zay could feel the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders, the stares, the whispers, the cold current of doubt rippling through the gallery like a slow, steady tide. He knew what they were thinking. He could hear it in the way they shifted in their seats, the way the bailiff adjusted his stance like he was already preparing for the fallout. Who does this boy think he is? What kind of fool walks into a courtroom and throws away the only lifeline he's got? But Zay didn't let the questions shake him. He didn't let the room see the part of him that was screaming quietly beneath his skin. The public defender sitting beside him, Lisa Thornton, let out a small, startled breath as if she'd just realized she was part of this circus, whether she liked it or not. She shifted in her seat, leaning toward him, her voice low but urgent, the kind of whisper meant for private spaces, not open courtrooms. "You don't have to do this, Isaiah," she murmured, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out her fingertips, brushing against the sleeve of his hoodie. "Let me handle this, please. You're not trained for this." Zay didn't turn to look at her. He didn't flinch away from her touch. He simply placed his hand gently over hers, pressing down just enough to let her know he had already made up his mind. She froze beneath his touch, her breath catching for a split second, before she slowly pulled her hand back, sinking into her chair like a woman bracing herself for impact. Zay could feel the weight of her fear, not for herself, but for him, and in some small, quiet way that gave him strength. He took a slow step forward, clearing his throat once more, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on Whittaker's unreadable face, "I'd like to exercise my constitutional right to self-representation." The judge didn't respond right away. He sat perfectly still, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line, as if weighing something heavier than he cared to admit. Finally, with a long, exaggerated sigh, he leaned forward once again, resting his elbows on the desk and folding his hands together like a preacher about to deliver bad news. "Son," he began the word, dropping like a stone into still water. "You do realize what you're asking for, don't you? You do realize this isn't television. This isn't some high school debate. You are standing in a courtroom facing real charges that could ruin your life." Zay nodded once slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Yes, sir. I understand exactly what's at stake." Whitaker let out another breath, shaking his head slightly, like a man watching a car speeding toward a cliff with no brakes. He turned to Lisa Thornton, raising an eyebrow in silent question. She shifted again, her hands curling into fists in her lap, but when she finally spoke, her voice was clear, if not entirely steady. "It's his right, Your Honor," she admitted softly, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. "I have to respect his decision." The judge nodded once, almost reluctantly, before turning his attention back to Zay. "All right then," he muttered, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. "Your motion is noted. You'll be representing yourself." A new wave of murmurs spread through the gallery, louder this time, like the first low rumble of a coming storm. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens scratching furiously against notepads. Even Karen Steele, who had spent the last several minutes wearing that smug little grin like it was stitched to her face, finally let it falter just a fraction. She didn't laugh this time. She didn't smirk. She simply watched him, her eyes narrowing, calculating as if she were sizing up a threat she hadn't seen coming. Zay could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his posture steady, his breathing slow and measured. He didn't dare look toward the gallery again, not yet. Not until he was sure he could hold himself together, but somewhere deep inside he felt the warmth of Clara's gaze like a steady hand resting on his back. He didn't have to turn to know she was watching, didn't have to hear her speak, to know she was silently praying the same prayer she had whispered over him every night since he was a boy. "Stand firm, Zay. Stand firm and speak your truth." And for the first time in his life, standing alone in the heart of a courtroom that had never truly seen him before, Zay Walker knew that the only voice that mattered in this moment was his own. Karen Steele stood up, slowly smoothing the front of her gray blazer, with the kind of practiced precision that told you she had done this 1,000 times before. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished courtroom floor. As she stepped forward, her every movement deliberate, like a woman stepping onto a stage she believed had been built just for her. She didn't need to glance at her notes. She didn't need to check her files. Everything about her posture said she had already won this fight, long before Zay Walker ever opened his mouth. She paused at the center of the room, turning slightly toward the jury box, her hands clasped gently in front of her, as if she were standing at the pulpit of a small-town church. The sunlight from the high windows framed her just right, catching the faint shimmer of her earrings, casting a glow across her carefully styled blonde hair. She let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, allowing the weight of the room to settle around her like an old familiar coat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice smooth as warm honey, carrying just enough gravity to sound official, without losing that southern charm. "The townsfolk love to hear what you've just witnessed is exactly the kind of arrogance that has brought us here today." A faint rustle stirred in the gallery behind her, the sound of people shifting in their seats, leaning in just a little closer to hear what she would say next. Karen didn't rush. She let her words sink in, pacing slowly toward the jury, her heels clicking softly like a metronome marking time. "This young man," she continued, gesturing lightly toward Zay without so much as turning her head, "wants you to believe he's the victim. He wants you to see him as some misunderstood boy caught up in something bigger than himself. But make no mistake, this case isn't about misunderstandings. This case is about choices, dangerous choices, criminal choices." She paused again, allowing her words to settle like dust in the sunlight. "On the night in question," she said, pulling a single sheet of paper from the folder on the prosecution table, "Isaiah Walker made the choice to leave his home, join a mob, and participate in what quickly turned from a peaceful gathering into a violent disruption of public safety." Zay's jaw tightened, but he stayed, seated, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. He knew she was baiting him, but he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of flinching. Karen turned toward the judge's bench, offering Whitaker a polite nod, before addressing the entire room again. "We have sworn testimony from multiple officers, including Sheriff Donnie Brooks himself," she said, holding the paper aloft like it was a sacred text, stating that the defendant not only struck a uniformed officer during the chaos, but also deliberately damaged government property by breaking courthouse windows. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd, though Zay noticed the way a few people exchanged glances, people who had been there that night, people who knew better but were too afraid to speak. Karen took another step closer to the jury, lowering her voice slightly, making it feel more personal, more intimate, as if she were confiding in each of them, one by one. "And let's not forget," she added, her tone tightening just enough to carry a sting, "the defendant's family legacy. His late father, Benjamin Walker, one of this city's most notorious civil rights agitators. His grandmother, Clara Walker, a woman known for stirring unrest under the guise of activism. Zay's fists curled tightly against the fabric of his jeans, his nails digging into his palms, but he didn't move. He didn't dare glance toward Clara, though he could feel her presence like a steady pulse in the room, her breath held somewhere between anger and heartbreak. Karen let the moment hang in the air like a noose tightening around Zay's neck. This family, she whispered almost sweetly, has a long history of standing in defiance of law and order. And now here we are again, watching the next generation follow in their footsteps. The gallery buzzed softly, like a swarm of flies gathering on something left too long in the sun. Karen turned back toward the judge, giving one final shake of her head, as if the outcome had already written itself. "Your Honor," she concluded, her voice swelling with that same manufactured sincerity, "the state intends to prove beyond any doubt that Isaiah Walker's actions were not only reckless, but criminal. He broke the law. He endangered public safety. And he must be held accountable." With that, she placed the paper back on the prosecution's table, smoothing it flat with the palm of her hand. She didn't look at Zay again as she returned to her seat. She didn't have to. The damage had been done. The seeds had been planted. Zay sat motionless for a long moment, his heartbeat pounding so hard in his ears he almost couldn't hear the whispered conversations swirling around him. His throat felt tight, like someone had wrapped an invisible rope around it, pulling just enough to remind him who they believed he was. He glanced down at his hands, studying the small, pale crescents his nails had left in his skin, and wondered for a fleeting second if they were right. If the blood in his veins had already sealed his fate the moment he was born into a family that never knew when to back down. But then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room until they found the only face that mattered. Clara. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just sat there, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her chin held high. And in her eyes, Zay didn't see fear. He didn't see defeat. He saw fire. Quiet, steady, burning fire. And just like that, the rope around his throat loosened. Because Karen Steele might have convinced the jury that this case was already over. She might have painted him as a reckless boy, too foolish to know when to sit down and shut up. But Zay Walker knew better. And for the first time since the trial began, he felt the corners of his mouth curl ever so slightly, not into a smile, but into something stronger. Determination. Zay let the last word from the prosecutor settle in the air like a stone dropped into deep water. He didn't rush to respond. He didn't shift in his seat or glance nervously toward the jury, like an amateur trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. Instead, he leaned back slightly, letting his fingers slide along the worn edge of the defense table, tracing a groove in the wood that had likely been carved there by someone else standing exactly where he stood now. Someone who had probably felt the same weight, the same pressure, the same gnawing sense that the whole room had already decided before they'd even opened their mouth. He could feel the heat of every eye in that courtroom pressing against the back of his neck like invisible hands trying to push him down, trying to remind him that he was standing on borrowed time. But Zay knew better. He knew the truth wasn't something you shouted. It was something you held, something you carried like a stone in your pocket, heavy, but steady, waiting for the right moment to let it fly. He stood slowly, the legs of his chair scraping softly against the floor as he rose to his full height. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He just breathed long and slow, as if the air itself might help him sort through the words piling up in his chest. "Your Honor," Zay began, his voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the murmur that still lingered like smoke in the air. "Before I begin my formal defense, I'd like to submit a request for additional evidence." Whitaker arched one gray eyebrow, leaning back in his chair again, clearly not expecting the first words out of Zay's mouth to sound so measured. "Is that so?" the judge replied, his voice carrying that same tired edge, as if he were humoring a child who didn't know the rules of the game. Zay nodded, once steady as stone. "Yes, sir. I'd like to request access to the surveillance footage from the Uptown Grill on the corner of Madison and 4th, recorded on the night of the incident." The moment the words left his mouth, Zay saw the smallest flicker of hesitation in Karen Steele's eyes. She masked it quickly, but not quickly enough. The prosecutor leaned forward, clearing her throat, her lips already curling into another one of those condescending smiles. "Your Honor, the state objects to this request," she announced, rising from her chair like she already knew she'd get her way. "The footage in question is irrelevant. The events inside that diner have no bearing on the charges before this court." Zay didn't even flinch. He didn't give her the satisfaction of backing down. He turned toward the judge, meeting Whitaker's gaze without blinking. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Zay replied, his voice steady but firm. "The footage will show the moments leading up to the alleged assault. It will prove that Sheriff Brooks initiated the confrontation outside the diner, not me." Another wave of murmurs stirred the gallery like wind rustling dry leaves. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room, with nothing more than a tired sigh, and the slow rub of his fingers across his temple. He turned toward Karen, his voice sharper now, more focused. "Counselor Steele, is there a reason this footage wasn't submitted with your original evidence?" Whitaker asked, his tone edging closer to something resembling curiosity, maybe even suspicion. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for everyone to notice. She pressed her lips together, adjusting her blazer, as if she could smooth the discomfort from her skin. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice losing a shade of its earlier confidence. "The footage was reviewed by law enforcement. It was determined to be inconclusive and not material to the prosecution's case." Zay took a step forward, his heart pounding harder now, but his voice never wavering. "May I speak to that, Your Honor?" he asked, not waiting for permission before continuing. "The footage shows me standing outside the diner unarmed with my hands in plain sight. It shows Sheriff Brooks approaching me aggressively, shouting first, pushing first. It shows that I never laid a hand on him until after he made physical contact with me." The judge leaned back again, squinting slightly, as if he were trying to read something invisible on the wall behind Zay's head. After what felt like a full minute of heavy silence, he let out a breath and turned back toward the prosecutor. "Well," Counselor Whitaker pressed, "do you have any objections to allowing the defense to submit this footage?" Karen's jaw tensed, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of her table. But when she finally spoke, her voice was tight, controlled, as if she were swallowing something bitter. "No objections, Your Honor," she replied through clenched teeth. Zay felt the knot in his chest loosen ever so slightly as he nodded, stepping back toward his table without another word. He knew this was just the beginning. He knew Karen would come at him even harder now. But for the first time since he walked into that courtroom, he had forced the state to flinch first, and that was something no one could take from him. He lowered himself back into his chair, folding his hands in his lap as he let the moments settle around him like dust on an empty street. He could feel Clara's eyes on him again, warm and steady, like sunlight through an old window pane. He didn't look back at her this time. He didn't need to, because deep down he already knew. The real fight had just begun. Zay sat there feeling the weight of the room press in tighter around him, but for once, he didn't let it crush him. He had seen the flicker of hesitation in Karen Steele's face, small as it was, and he knew exactly what it meant. She hadn't expected him to push back. She hadn't expected him to know about that diner footage. And if she hadn't expected that there was a good chance, she hadn't prepared for what he was about to do next. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, pressing his fingertips together like he'd seen his father do 1,000 times across their old kitchen table. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it carried through the courtroom with a quiet force that seemed to pull every ear toward him. "Your Honor," he began again, not rushing, not stalling, just filling the space like he belonged there. "There's another detail in the prosecution's case I'd like to address before we proceed." Judge Whitaker sighed like a man being asked to sit through one more commercial before his program started again. He rubbed his temple with the edge of his thumb, glancing toward Karen Steele, as if asking silently whether this circus was going to drag on all day. But when he looked back at Zay, there was something else in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even the smallest flicker of respect. "Go on," the judge muttered, leaning back in his chair again, folding his arms across his chest like he was settling in to be entertained. Zay nodded, once steady as ever. He stood up slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make the silence feel heavier than it needed to be. He took a step toward the jury, not too close, just enough to bring them into his orbit without forcing their attention. "The prosecution has presented sworn statements from Sheriff Donnie Brooks." Zay continued, his voice tightening slightly as he spoke the name, "but there's a problem with those statements." He paused, letting the words settle. He could feel the gallery leaning in again, the air shifting like the whole room had started holding its breath. In Sheriff Brooks' report, Zay explained, lifting a single page from the file in front of him, "He claims that after I allegedly assaulted him, I fled the scene, evaded capture, and continued to incite the crowd for another 30 minutes, before being subdued by officers at the courthouse steps." Karen Steele shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but she didn't interrupt. "Not yet." Zay let the page fall softly back onto the table, the sound barely audible over the tension crackling in the air. "The problem," Zay said, taking another slow step toward the center of the room, "is that this report doesn't match the official arrest record filed later that night." He turned toward the judge again, his heart pounding harder now but his voice never shaking. "According to the arresting officer's report," he continued, "I was detained less than 10 minutes after the incident outside the diner, not 30. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing though he didn't speak. Zay pressed on. "And if you review the body cam timestamp provided by Officer Wells," Zay added, flipping to another page in the file, "you'll see that I was already in handcuffs before the first window at the courthouse was even reported broken." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, louder this time, sharper like the crack of a whip, in a room that had grown too quiet for too long. Karen stood abruptly, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "Objection, Your Honor." She snapped, her tone sharper than it had been all morning. "This is speculation. The defense is twisting timelines to confuse the jury." Zay didn't flinch. He turned toward her, holding her gaze like he was daring her to keep going. "With respect, Counselor," Zay replied, keeping his voice steady, "I'm simply reading from your own evidence." Whitaker raised a hand, silencing both of them with a single tired gesture. He leaned back once more, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully as he glanced toward the jury, then back at Karen. "Well, Counselor Steele," the judge muttered, his voice sounding more like curiosity than impatience. "Now can you explain this discrepancy?" Karen's jaw tightened. She glanced at her notes, flipping through the pages like she was searching for an escape that wasn't there. Finally, she let out a breath through her nose, shaking her head ever so slightly. "The state stands by its timeline, Your Honor," she replied, though her voice had lost just a fraction of its earlier confidence. Zay nodded, stepping back toward his table, placing both hands on the surface as if to ground himself. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply let the truth settle between them like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. He glanced briefly toward the gallery, toward Clara. She hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched. But in her eyes, Zay saw something he hadn't dared hope for in days. Pride. And it was enough to remind him why he had come this far. He turned back toward the judge, standing taller now, his voice carrying the weight of every quiet lesson his grandmother had ever whispered into his ear. "I have nothing further on this point, Your Honor." Zay finished, his tone steady, calm, and final. And with that, the room seemed to shift once more, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with the silent recognition that maybe, just maybe, this young man wasn't as out of his depth as they had all believed. Zay stood at the center of that old courtroom, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him like a second skin, heavier than the fabric of his hoodie, heavier than the chains of expectation that had followed him since the day he first learned to walk. He could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning unit kicking on somewhere near the ceiling, that low mechanical whine, filling the silence like a distant train rumbling through a quiet town. He took another slow breath, closing his eyes just long enough to steady himself, and when he opened them again, his gaze didn't land on the judge or the prosecutor or even the jury. It landed on the faces of the people sitting behind him, the men and women who had filled those benches not just today but for decades before him. He could see Deacon Earl sitting near the back, clutching his worn Bible tight against his chest like it might shield him from the disappointment in his eyes. He could see Mrs. Thompson, her hands wringing the edge of her sweater, her lips pressed so tight they'd turned pale. And he could see the row of younger faces, kids from his neighborhood, kids who had watched him grow up, who had watched him carry groceries for Miss Lila when her knees gave out, who had watched him rake leaves in the churchyard without ever asking for a dime. They were all here watching him now, their faces, a blur of doubt, of hope, of fear. Zay swallowed hard, pressing his palms flat against the table as if trying to keep himself anchored to something real. He didn't have a fancy speech prepared. He didn't have a stack of papers or a folder filled with legal jargon. What he had was the truth, the kind of truth that lived in the quiet spaces between words, the kind you carried in your bones when you knew what it meant to stand on the wrong side of a system that was never built for you. He took a step toward the jury box, slow and steady, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He didn't pace. He didn't perform. He simply stood there, breathing in the heavy air, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket pulled too tight. "I know what you're thinking," he began, his voice low but sure, filling the room without needing to shout. "I know some of you have already decided who I am, what kind of person I must be to end up standing here. He paused, glancing toward the gallery, locking eyes with Mrs. Thompson for just a moment before looking back at the jurors. "But I'm asking you," he continued, his voice tightening ever so slightly, "to look past what you've heard, past what you've been told, and remember the history of this town." He took another step forward, his fingers curling loosely at his sides, his breathing steady, though his throat felt like it might close up at any second. "Montgomery knows what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth," he whispered the words, barely louder than a breath. "We've lived that history. We've walked those streets. Some of you in this very room remember what it felt like to be told to sit at the back of the bus, to drink from a different fountain, to lower your eyes, when a man in a uniform told you that you weren't worth the air you were breathing." The room shifted again, the gallery growing still. The weight of those memories pulling at every corner of the space like gravity itself had gotten heavier. "You remember," Selma Zay said, his voice stronger, now building like a wave, rising on the edge of something bigger. "You remember the bridge, the batons, the blood. You remember how they called peaceful protesters criminals, how they twisted the truth until it fit the story they wanted to tell." Karen Steele shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening, as if she could hold back the tide with nothing more than clenched teeth. Zay didn't look at her. He didn't have to. "I'm not asking you to ignore the law," Zay continued, his voice steady, but filled with something raw, something real. "I'm asking you to remember that the law has been used as a weapon before, and sometimes the truth gets buried under the weight of the people who have the power to write the story." He let his eyes sweep the room again, landing finally on Clara. She hadn't moved, she hadn't spoken. But the way she held herself straight and unbroken was louder than any word he could have spoken. Zay turned back to the jury, taking one last breath before letting the words fall from his lips like the last stone he had left to throw. "I'm not the first person to stand here and be called a threat," he whispered, "and if we aren't careful, I won't be the last." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He stepped back toward his table, lowering himself slowly into his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He felt the tension settle in his shoulders, heavy but familiar, like a weight he had carried for so long that he almost didn't notice it anymore. And for the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like it was closing in on him. It felt like it had finally started to listen. Zay sat back down slowly, carefully, as if the air had thickened around him and every movement carried twice the weight it should. He let his hands fall onto the table in front of him, his fingers curling into the wood like he needed something solid to hold on to. His chest rose and fell with every breath, slow and steady, but deep down he could feel the weight of the next step pressing against him like a hand on the back of his neck, pushing him toward a ledge he couldn't afford to fall from. He knew it wasn't enough to remind them of history. It wasn't enough to stir their memories. He needed to show them something real, something they couldn't ignore or twist into another version of the same tired story. He glanced down at the worn legal pad in front of him, the one Lisa Thornton had slid across the table that morning before she knew she wouldn't be the one standing for him today. There, written in his own shaky handwriting, was a single name circled twice in heavy black ink: Ruby Jenkins. He pressed his lips together, tightening his jaw as he leaned toward the microphone. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice sounding just a little heavier now, like it was carrying something more than words the defense would like to call a witness. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly through his nose like a man growing tired of hearing his own name called. "And who exactly do you plan on parading up here next, Mr. Walker?" the judge asked, more out of routine than curiosity. Zay lifted his head, his voice not rising, not straining, but carrying that same steady weight it had all along. "The defense calls Miss Ruby Jenkins to the stand," he announced. The reaction wasn't loud, but it was sharp. A few heads turned toward the back of the gallery, toward the far corner where a small, elderly woman sat, clutching her purse against her chest like it held all the strength she had left in her bones. Ruby Jenkins, barely 5 feet tall in her Sunday dress and scuffed church shoes, stood slowly, her hands trembling as she leaned on the worn cane beside her. Zay watched her every step as she made her way down the aisle, her chin held just high enough to let the room know she wasn't ashamed of being called to speak. The bailiff moved toward her, offering an arm to steady her climb onto the witness stand. She took it without a word, lowering herself carefully into the chair like she was settling into the front pew on a Sunday morning. Once she was seated, the bailiff leaned in, holding out the Bible, and Ruby placed her frail hand on top of it without hesitation. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff asked. Ruby nodded once, her voice soft but clear. "I do." Zay stood slowly walking toward the witness stand with careful, deliberate steps. He didn't hold any papers. He didn't have any legal jargon ready on his tongue. He just stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle between them like something sacred. Miss Jenkins, Zay began gently. "Can you tell the court where you were on the night of the protest?" Ruby shifted slightly, gripping the edge of the stand like she needed to hold herself steady. "I was sitting on the bench outside the Uptown Grill," she replied, her voice cracking just a little around the edges but holding firm. "I go there every Wednesday after my shift at the church. Been doing that for 12 years now." Zay nodded, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. "And did you see what happened between me and Sheriff Brooks that night?" Ruby nodded again, her lips tightening as she glanced toward Karen Steele, then back to Zay. "I saw it all," she whispered, her voice growing just a little stronger. "I saw that sheriff come marching up to you shouting like you'd set the whole city on fire. I saw him put his hands on you first. I saw him shove you so hard you nearly lost your balance." The room stirred again, another wave of murmurs sweeping through the gallery like a wind stirring dry leaves. Judge Whitaker raised a hand to settle the noise, but Zay didn't stop. "Did you record what you saw, Miss Jenkins?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a breath. Ruby nodded once more, reaching slowly into her purse, pulling out an old flip phone with shaking hands. "I did," she whispered. "It ain't much, but I got it right here." Karen Steele shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Objection, Your Honor," she snapped. "The defense cannot submit new evidence without proper notification to the state." But Judge Whitaker leaned forward, squinting toward Ruby Jenkins, his voice sharper now, more alive than it had been all morning. "Let's see what she's got," the judge muttered, waving the bailiff toward the witness stand. The bailiff took the phone gently from Ruby's hands, carrying it toward the court clerk, who plugged it into the overhead display. The screen flickered to life, grainy and unsteady, the kind of footage you'd expect from a phone older than some of the kids sitting in the back of the courtroom. But it was clear enough. Clear enough to show Sheriff Donnie Brooks lunging toward Zay, shoving him backward, shouting words that the microphone barely caught, but the body language made crystal clear. Zay didn't move as the footage played. He didn't flinch as the gallery leaned forward, silent now, hanging on every second. He just stood there, breathing slow and steady, letting the truth fill the space between them like fresh air rushing into a room that had been sealed too long. When the footage ended, the room stayed quiet, not a single whisper breaking the thick silence that followed. Zay turned toward the judge, his voice soft but unshaken. "No further questions, Your Honor." And as he returned to his seat, lowering himself slowly into his chair, Zay let his eyes meet Clara's once again. And this time they both knew the tide had shifted. The video ended flickering to black on the courtroom monitor, like someone had pulled the air right out of the room. You could almost hear the way the silence settled afterward, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nobody moved at first, not the judge, not the jury, not even Karen Steele, who stood frozen by her table with her hands clenched so tight the knuckles had gone pale. It felt like time had cracked open, like the truth had slipped through the seams, and for the first time in that courtroom it wasn't a story they could twist or bury. It was right there on the screen, raw and undeniable. Zay sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, not leaning forward, not glancing back to see who was watching. He knew they had all seen it. He knew every heart in that room had shifted, even if their faces hadn't caught up to the moment yet. He closed his eyes for just a breath, letting the weight of it press into his ribs, not crushing him this time, but steadying him like an anchor, finding the ocean floor. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, slowly rubbing his chin with the edge of his fingers like a man sifting through the ashes of something he hadn't expected to burn. He let out a long breath, the kind that sounds like it carries the weight of years, maybe even regrets, though he didn't speak just yet. His gaze drifted toward the jury, who now sat stiff and silent, their hands resting awkwardly on their laps, their eyes darting toward one another like they were suddenly unsure what ground they were standing on. Karen Steele cleared her throat, but her voice cracked on the first word, forcing her to start again, softer this time, almost brittle. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the prosecution would like to remind the court that the video does not change the fact that the defendant's fingerprints were found on government property damaged during the protest." Her words fell flat like a stone, skipping once before sinking without a ripple. Zay let his jaw tighten, but he didn't rise to speak. Not yet. He waited, letting the silence stretch between them like a rope pulled tight between two hands. Whitaker shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses with a slow, deliberate movement before turning his attention back to Zay. "Mister?" Walker. The judge said, his voice lower now, like he was trying to read something in Zay's face. He hadn't noticed before. Do you have anything to say in response? Zay stood carefully, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor, planting his feet like he had every intention of carrying the moment all the way to the end. He didn't reach for notes. He didn't glance toward Lisa Thornton for backup. He just breathed once more, long and steady, before turning to face the jury. "You've seen the video," he began, his voice, not louder but heavier now, like every word carried the weight of something deeper than the charges against him. "You've seen what really happened that night. You saw who started it. You saw who escalated it." He let his eyes sweep the jurors' faces one by one, pausing just long enough on each person to make sure they couldn't look away. "But you're being asked to ignore that," he continued, his voice tightening ever so slightly, "because my fingerprints were found on a broken window." He took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was letting them in on something private. "Let me ask you something," he whispered. "Have you ever reached out to stop something before it got worse? Have you ever put your hand on something not to destroy it but to try and hold it together?" He paused, letting the words settle in their chest like small stones dropped into deep water. "That's what I did that night," he said softly. "I wasn't throwing bricks. I wasn't leading a riot. I was trying to stop it. I put my hand on that glass to stop someone else from breaking it, from turning a peaceful night into something we'd all regret." Karen let out a sharp breath, shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But Zay didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury leaned just a little closer, the way the gallery had gone completely still again. "I'm not a perfect man," Zay added, his voice dropping into something softer, almost like confession. "I've made mistakes. I've been angry. I've been loud when maybe I should have been quiet. But I've never, not once, set out to hurt this city. This is my home. These are my people. I don't want to tear it down. I want to build something better." He let out a slow breath, turning toward Judge Whitaker for just a moment, then back to the jury. "So you tell me," he finished, his voice steady, "as stone is that the story you're willing to believe? That a young man trying to stop something from falling apart is the one you need to fear the most?" He didn't wait for an answer. He just stepped back toward his seat, lowering himself slowly into the chair, as if every muscle in his body had finally started to shake. He folded his hands in his lap, staring down at the table, knowing that the weight of the room had shifted again. And this time, it didn't shift back. Karen Steele stayed frozen in place longer than anyone expected. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands pressed so flat against the prosecution's table that her knuckles stood out like ridges of bone beneath pale skin. The usual sharpness in her voice, the confident rhythm that had carried her through countless trials before this one, had vanished into the air, leaving behind something brittle and tight in the space around her. She shifted her weight slightly, glanced toward the jury, then down at her notes, flipping a page as if searching for something that might pull this case back from the edge. But Zay knew there was nothing left to find. The moment had already passed her by, and the courtroom knew it. Still, Karen squared her shoulders, straightened her blazer, and took a single step forward, trying to gather whatever authority she had left. She cleared her throat softly, the sound cracking just a little as she forced herself to look toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice softer, now less like a prosecutor in control, and more like someone trying to steady themselves on shaking ground. "The defense would have you believe that a video shot from a shaky phone on a dark street corner tells the entire story." She paused, but the weight of her words didn't seem to land the way they had earlier. The jury didn't lean in. The gallery didn't shift. Even Judge Whitaker sat quieter than before, his hands resting on the edge of his desk, his gaze unreadable. Karen swallowed hard, pressing on anyway. "The state does not dispute what you saw," she continued, tightening her grip on the lectern, as though holding it any looser might reveal the tremor in her fingers. "But the fact remains, physical evidence links the defendant to damage done to this courthouse, damage done to property that belongs to every single citizen in this room." Zay let out a slow breath through his nose, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but steady enough to keep himself from standing too soon. Karen glanced down again, flipping another page, searching one last time for something solid to stand on. Her voice dropped lower, almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as the jury. "Intentions," she whispered, "no matter how noble they may sound, do not erase the consequences of reckless actions." Her words hung in the air for a moment, but even she seemed to know they carried less weight now than they had before. She sighed softly, stepping back toward her seat, her eyes darting toward Judge Whitaker, as though silently asking him to bring this to a close. But the judge didn't move. He didn't clear his throat or shuffle his papers. He simply leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of his glasses lightly against the desk, staring at the floor like he was listening to something only he could hear. And that's when Zay stood again. No one called on him, no one asked him to speak, but something in the air shifted when he rose to his feet, as if the entire room knew this was the moment they'd all been waiting for without even realizing it. He didn't move toward the jury this time. He stayed right where he was standing tall behind the defense table, his hands resting lightly on the wood as he looked around the room one last time. He took in every face, the jurors, the gallery, even Karen Steele, who finally let her gaze meet his without flinching. And then he looked to the front row, where Clara Walker sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face calm, but her eyes burning with something deeper than pride, something closer to faith. Zay let out a slow breath and spoke softly but clear enough that no one in that room could miss a single word. "Actions have consequences," he said, echoing Karen's words, but without the sharpness, without the bitterness, and so do lies. The gallery stirred again, but this time no one dared to interrupt. "I've stood here and listened to people tell you who they think I am," Zay continued, his voice steady as stone. "I've listened to them paint me as a threat, a troublemaker, a boy who doesn't know when to back down." He paused, letting his hands press a little firmer into the table. "But I know who I am," he whispered, "and deep down I think, so do you." He glanced toward the jury, holding their gaze one by one. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," he finished, his voice soft but full, like the last note of a song played in an empty church. "I'm asking for your honesty." With that, he lowered himself back into his seat, folding his hands once again in his lap. He didn't look around the room this time. He didn't need to, because when you've said everything that needs to be said, there's nothing left but the silence that follows. And for Zay Walker, that silence had never felt more like freedom. The stillness in the room held for what felt like forever. The walls didn't creak, the air didn't stir, and not a single cough or whisper dared to break the quiet. Zay sat completely still, his palms flat on the table, his shoulders low, but steady, as if he had finally laid something down that had weighed on him far too long. He didn't look at the jury, he didn't look at Judge Whitaker, he just kept his eyes on the grain of the wood in front of him, tracing the faint lines and worn edges, like they held all the answers no one had spoken aloud. And then it happened. From the gallery, slow and almost too soft to hear, at first came the sound of shifting fabric. A small rustling, barely noticeable, like the faint brushing of leaves on a windless day. Zay didn't lift his head until he heard the familiar creak of old joints and worn shoes sliding across the wooden floor. The footsteps were light, unsteady, but purposeful, moving toward the center of the courtroom, stopping just a few steps behind him. He knew that sound. He had heard it every Sunday morning when Clara Walker rose from her seat at the front of their church to address the congregation. He had heard it in their kitchen on long nights when she couldn't sleep, when she paced the floor with her arms crossed, whispering prayers beneath her breath. And now here she was again, standing just behind him, clearing her throat softly like a woman who didn't need anyone's permission to speak. The judge didn't stop her. The bailiff didn't move. No one in the courtroom dared to interrupt, as Clara took another step forward, standing tall despite the years that had weighed heavy on her small frame. She placed one hand on Zay's shoulder, not hard, not demanding, but steady, grounding him like a lighthouse in a storm. And when she spoke, her voice was low, rough around the edges, but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "You've all heard enough," Clara said softly, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent fighting battles no one else dared to name. "You've heard the law. You've heard the accusations. You've heard my grandson speak his truth." She paused, and in that breath, the silence grew deeper, like the whole world had leaned in to listen. "But you haven't heard from me," she continued, her voice growing just a little stronger with every word. "And I reckon it's about time you did." Zay felt his throat tighten, but he didn't move. He didn't stop her. He just let her words wash over him like a tide he hadn't realized he needed. "I've lived in this town longer than some of you have been alive," Clara whispered. "I've seen this courtroom filled with faces just like mine sitting where my grandson sits now. I've heard judges speak the same tired words. I've watched prosecutors twist the same tired stories. And I've seen juries time and again choose the easy road, the one that lets them sleep at night, even if it means condemning the innocent." Her hand tightened slightly on Zay's shoulder, and he could feel the tremble in her fingers, not from fear but from something deeper, resolve. "But I'm here to tell you," Clara said, her voice rising just a little, steady as stone. "My grandson is not a criminal. He is not a threat. He is not the story you've been sold. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room, landing on the jury with an intensity that made even the most stoic among them shift uncomfortably in their seats. "He is the legacy of every man and woman who dared to believe this city could be better," she continued, her voice softening, but never losing its strength. "He is the child of hope, the product of struggle, the proof that we have come too far to let fear write the ending to this story." The room stayed frozen, every breath held tight, every heart caught in the quiet gravity of her words. Clara took one final breath, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell. "And I will not sit silent," she finished, her voice steady, full, unshaken, "while you try to erase everything we've fought for." With that, she released Zay's shoulders, stepping back without waiting for acknowledgement, without needing applause or validation. She simply returned to her seat, folding her hands in her lap once more, her back straight, her chin high, her eyes unyielding. And when Zay finally lifted his head, letting his gaze settle on her face again, he realized something he hadn't dared to believe until that moment. He wasn't standing alone. Judge Whittaker sat in complete stillness for a long, heavy moment after Clara Walker returned to her seat. His fingers rested loosely on the edge of the bench, no longer drumming, no longer twitching in that restless way they had earlier in the day. He didn't glance toward the jury, nor did he shift his gaze to Karen Steele or Zay. Instead, his eyes dropped to the open file in front of him, the same file he had flipped through hours earlier, with nothing more than routine disinterest. But now the pages seemed heavier, as if every word printed there carried a weight he could no longer ignore. He reached up slowly, removing his glasses, setting them down carefully on the desk, with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. He rubbed his face with both hands, pressing his palms against his eyes, as if trying to push back the memory of what he had just witnessed, of what had unfolded in his courtroom, right in front of him, piece by piece, until there was no part of the story left untouched. The room waited silent but alive, as if the walls themselves knew something was shifting in the air. And then, without a word, Whittaker stood. He didn't announce a ruling. He didn't lean forward and bang his gavel. Instead, he turned toward the side door of the courtroom, nodding once to the bailiff, who opened it without question. The judge disappeared through it like a man walking out of a storm and into a place no one else was allowed to follow. The door clicked softly shut behind him. Zay sat perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His heart thudded in his chest, not with fear but with the heavy, quiet knowledge that they had reached the edge of something. The gallery shifted softly behind him, but no one dared to speak above a whisper. In the judge's chambers, Whittaker stood alone, staring at the wall behind his desk, where a single framed photograph hung crooked just enough to be noticeable now that the room had fallen so still. It was a black-and-white photo, slightly faded at the edges, of a young man, standing on the steps of a courthouse, much smaller than this one. His shoulders squared, his face tight, with something that looked a lot like hope, though it had long since hardened into something else. That young man was him. He had been 24 years old, fresh out of law school, full of the kind of idealism that makes you believe you can change the world with nothing more than your voice and a briefcase full of case law. Back then, he had stood on the right side of protests. He had walked alongside people like Clara Walker, though he doubted she even remembered. Back then, he had promised himself he would never become the kind of man who let the system write other people's stories for them. And yet here he was. Whittaker pressed his palm flat against the photograph, closing his eyes for just a moment, as the weight of that realization settled over him like dust on old furniture. He let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been rubbing the back of his neck, like he could shake off the years of habit that had piled on top of him. He turned away from the photo, walking slowly toward the window, overlooking the street below. From here he could see the front steps of the courthouse, the same steps where reporters had gathered that morning, eager for sound bites, ready to feed the headlines they had already written. He could see the city stretching out beyond the square, could almost hear the hum of life moving forward, uncaring, unbothered by the small shifts that changed the course of people's lives forever. And he wondered, not for the first time, how many stories he had let slide through his hands without really listening. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, pressing his fingers against the glass, as if searching for something on the other side. Finally, he turned back toward the door. And with every step back toward that bench, Judge Whittaker knew when he opened that door again, he wouldn't be the same man who had walked through it. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Judge Whittaker stepped back into the courtroom like a man returning from somewhere much farther away than the room next door. His steps were slower now, not with hesitation, but with something more deliberate, more weighted, like every inch of ground he crossed had suddenly become sacred. He didn't glance toward the gallery, didn't acknowledge the subtle rustling of people shifting in their seats as they leaned forward to watch his every move. He didn't speak right away either. He simply made his way back to his bench, placed his glasses gently back on his face, and rested his hands, palms down, fingers spread slightly on the polished wood in front of him. Zay sat motionless, his breath steady but shallow, like every fiber in his body had learned to wait in moments like this. His palms pressed lightly against his knees, his fingers curling just slightly, as if holding onto something invisible, something fragile but real. Karen Steele, standing behind her table, tried to square her shoulders again, tried to wear that familiar look of professional control, but something in her posture betrayed her. The sharpness had dulled, the confidence softened, and though her chin remained high, her eyes carried the weight of a woman already bracing for a truth she couldn't undo. Judge Whitaker scanned the room slowly, taking in the faces, the jury, the attorneys, the gallery, and when his gaze finally landed on Zay, it stayed there a moment longer than anyone expected. Not cold, not indifferent, but searching like a man trying to find something in a place he had overlooked for far too long. He cleared his throat softly, but when he spoke, his voice carried none of the casual sarcasm it had held earlier that day. It came out steady, low, and unmistakably clear. "Mr. Walker," he began, letting the name settle like a stone in still water, "you've done something today that very few people in this room expected." Zay didn't move, didn't blink, just waited for the words to find their place. "You've shown this court that the truth," the judge continued, his voice thickening just slightly, "sometimes lives in places the law forgets to look." A soft murmur stirred in the gallery, but Whitaker raised his hand gently, not in warning but in acknowledgement, like he understood the air had to move again sometime. He turned toward the jury, letting his eyes pass over them one by one. "And while it is not my place to tell you what to believe," he added, "it is my duty to ensure that justice is not built on assumptions, fear, or convenience." He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, the weight of his own words settling into the space between them. "This case," he continued, "was never as simple as it first appeared. And while the charges brought forth by the state carry legal merit on paper, the evidence presented in this courtroom tells another story." He paused again, his gaze drifting back toward Zay. "A story," he whispered, "that I believe this jury is now fully equipped to understand." Karen shifted slightly, as if preparing to speak, but Whitaker raised his hand once more, stopping her before the words could leave her mouth. However, he added, his voice firm but not unkind, "before we move to deliberations, I'm exercising my authority to dismiss all charges against Mr. Walker." The words hit the room like a silent wave crashing through still water. No one spoke. No one dared. Even the air seemed to hesitate, hanging thick and full in the space between disbelief and realization. Zay felt the breath catch in his throat, his chest tightening not from fear but from something sharper, something brighter, like the first break of sunlight after a long dark night. Whitaker leaned forward, resting his arms on the bench as he let out one final breath. "And for what it's worth," the judge finished softly, "you should consider law school." Zay let the words settle, not with a smile, not with relief, but with something deeper, a quiet recognition that for the first time in a long time, someone had seen him for who he really was. He stood slowly steady on his feet and turned toward the gallery where Clara Walker sat waiting, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes glistening with something too full to name. And in that moment, nothing else mattered, because they had already won. Zay didn't remember how his feet carried him out of that courtroom. He didn't remember the sound of the gallery rising to its feet, didn't notice the dozens of strangers standing along the aisle as he walked past, their faces blurring together like the edges of a photograph left out in the rain. All he could hear was the distant hum of the city outside, the faint creak of the courthouse doors as they swung open, and the steady, almost weightless sound of his grandmother's footsteps just a few paces behind him. For the first time in hours, the air outside felt real crisp and wide, and open in a way that pressed against his chest until he finally remembered how to breathe. The sky above Montgomery stretched pale and cloudless, the late afternoon sun painting long, soft shadows across the courthouse steps. Reporters were already there, clustered like birds on a telephone wire, their cameras raised microphones, pointed voices rising like a sudden wave crashing onto dry land. Mr. Walker, can you comment on the judge's decision? What do you plan to do next? Did you expect to win?" The questions hit him like static, empty noise, buzzing around the edges of something much larger than their headlines would ever capture. Zay didn't stop. He didn't glance toward the cameras or reach for the microphones shoved toward his face. He just kept walking step by step, until he reached the bottom of the steps where Clara stood, waiting with her arms crossed her face, unreadable, her eyes steady as ever. She didn't speak right away. She didn't smile or open her arms like the movies said she should. She just stood there looking at him, really looking as if searching for something deeper than relief, something truer than victory. And Zay, feeling the weight of everything they had carried together, let out a slow breath and whispered, "I didn't know if I could do it." Clara's face softened, not with pity, not with pride, but with something older, something heavier, like a woman who had stood in that same place, carrying that same fear more times than she could count. She stepped forward, cupping his face gently with both hands, her thumbs brushing the corners of his jaw. "Oh, but you did," she whispered back, her voice cracking just a little, like the words had been waiting in her chest for far too long. "You did." For the first time since the verdict, Zay let himself breathe deeply, closing his eyes as Clara pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him like she had when he was a boy too young to understand why the world felt so heavy on his back. He let himself lean into her, let the hum of reporters and the clicks of cameras fade into something distant and meaningless. And when they finally pulled apart, Clara reached up, brushing the side of his face one last time, before leaning in, her voice low and steady in his ear. "This ain't the end, Zay," she whispered. "This is just the beginning." Zay nodded slowly, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, looking up at the courthouse steps where Judge Whitaker still stood, watching from the doorway like a man trying to reconcile the weight of his choices. Their eyes met briefly, no words exchanged, no nod of acknowledgement, but Zay saw something there he hadn't expected. Not victory, not defeat, but something closer to reflection. Zay turned away, stepping down onto the sidewalk, Clara's hand slipping into his as they walked together toward the edge of the crowd. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't know how the city would remember this day, or what story the reporters would write before the sun set. But in that moment, with the hum of Montgomery buzzing soft and steady in the distance, he knew one thing for certain. He had found his voice. And no one, no courtroom, no judge, no system could ever take that from him again. The house stood just as he remembered it, tucked quietly between two old oak trees on the far side of Monroe Street. The paint on the porch rails had started to peel again, curling in soft chips beneath the weight of too many seasons, and the windows, still smudged with fingerprints from long-forgotten days, reflected the soft glow of the afternoon sun, like they were holding onto memories no one had bothered to dust off. The brass door handle was cool beneath his palm as he pushed it open, the hinges groaning softly as if surprised to be called back to life after all this time. Zay stepped inside his shoes, echoing lightly against the scuffed wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of old paper dust, and the lingering trace of cedar that had lived in the walls since before he was born. He let the door fall closed behind him, leaning back against it for a breath, letting the silence of the space wrap around him like an old blanket pulled from the back of a closet. Clara stood on the porch for a long moment before following him inside, her hand trailing along the chipped doorframe as she crossed the threshold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just stood there, watching, as Zay moved through the narrow hallway past the old coat rack, still holding a single dusty umbrella toward the office, at the back of the house where his father had once worked long into the night. The door to the office creaked as Zay pushed it open. The room looked almost untouched. Books still lined the shelves in neat leaning rows, and the heavy oak desk stood in the center like an anchor in a sea of memory. A single chair, worn soft from years of use, sat tucked beneath it, and on top of the desk, resting beneath a thin layer of dust, was a small wooden plaque. Zay stepped closer, brushing his fingers across the surface until the name beneath revealed itself. Benjamin Walker Esq. Zay let his hand rest on the plaque for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone dropped gently into deep water. He could almost hear his father's voice again, low and steady, reading case files aloud as if trying to memorize every word. He could almost see the way his father used to lean back in that chair, rubbing his chin when the words grew too heavy to carry alone. Clara stepped quietly into the doorway, her voice soft as a whisper breaking through the stillness. "He kept everything just the way he liked it," she said, her eyes glistening as she looked around the room. "Said one day you'd come back and sit here." Zay swallowed hard, running his hand along the edge of the desk before slowly lowering himself into the chair. It felt bigger than he remembered, heavier beneath his weight, as if the years had stretched it somehow, turning it into something more than just a piece of furniture. He leaned forward, pressing his palms flat against the desk, breathing in the faint, familiar scent of leather and ink. Clara moved closer, reaching into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small, freshly engraved nameplate, the brass catching the afternoon light as she set it gently beside the old one. Zay stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening as he read the words aloud, soft and steady, like a promise he hadn't known he was ready to make. Isaiah Walker, future attorney at law. He leaned back slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle into the quiet corners of the room. The hum of the city outside felt miles away, now softened by the thick walls that had once held the hopes of a man who had believed perhaps more than anyone that justice could live in places like this. Zay let his eyes drift toward the window where the golden light spilled through the dusty glass, painting the floor in soft, broken patterns. He could hear Clara's steady breathing behind him, could feel the quiet pride in her presence, and for the first time in a long time he felt something rise in his chest that had nothing to do with fear, nothing to do with anger. It was purpose. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like. He didn't know how many battles still waited beyond the door he had just walked through. But as he sat there, the weight of his father's legacy resting steady beneath his fingertips, Zay knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was exactly where he needed to be. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. You know, sometimes life has a way of putting us in situations where it feels like the whole world is already set against us, like the ending has already been written before we even have a chance to speak. But this story reminds us that no matter how loud the world gets, no matter how stacked the system might seem, your voice still matters. And more importantly, the truth matters. Zay Walker stood in that courtroom alone, facing a system that had swallowed up people like him for generations. But he didn't let fear write his story. He stood on what he knew, spoke from his heart, and proved that when you have the courage to face what's broken, you have the power to change it. So maybe you're watching this today feeling like your best days are behind you, but let me tell you they're not. Whether you're 70 or 17, you still have a voice. You still have something to stand for. And sometimes the biggest difference you can make starts with refusing to sit down when the world expects you to. Because it's never too late to speak up, to stand tall, and to fight for what's right. And if this message spoke to you today, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with someone you care about. Together, let's keep these conversations going. We'll see you in the next one.